New reporting exposes J.D. Vance vs. Netanyahu feud over failed predictions, as Israel censors US media, and the reporting that just surfaced is unlike anything we've seen in years. J.D. Vance and Benjamin Netanyahu are not on the same page. That's not a rumor, that's not speculation from anonymous sources, with an agenda. That's what new reporting is now revealing about the private relationship between the Vice President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Israel. And the content of that disagreement is even more significant than the fact that it exists, because this isn't a dispute about diplomatic protocol or scheduling or the kind of minor friction that inevitably exists between any two governments. This is a substantive, serious disagreement about predictions, about what was promised, about what was supposed to happen, and about why it didn't. At the same time that this reporting is emerging, something else is happening that makes the story even more alarming. Israel is censoring American press, not restricting access, not limiting certain kinds of coverage. Censoring, blocking, preventing American journalists from doing their jobs in ways that the United States government is now being forced to respond to. These two stories, the Vance-Netanyahu feud and the press censorship, are connected, and that connection tells you something important about where the US-Israeli relationship stands right now, something that the official statements from both governments are not telling you. Let's start with the feud itself. The new reporting describes a relationship between Vance and Netanyahu that has deteriorated significantly over a specific issue. Netanyahu's government made a series of predictions about how the conflict in Gaza would unfold, about how long it would take, about what the outcomes would be, about the regional consequences, and the humanitarian situation, and the international response. Those predictions, according to the reporting, were presented to American officials, including Vance, with a confidence and specificity that shaped American policy decisions. And they were wrong, not marginally wrong, not off by a matter of degree. Wrong in ways that had significant consequences for American credibility, American policy, and American relationships across the region. When the predictions failed to materialize, the American side wanted answers, accountability, some acknowledgement that the intelligence and the analysis that had been provided were not accurate. What they got instead, according to the reporting, was resistance, deflection, a continued insistence from the Netanyahu government that the situation was being managed and that the original framework remained valid. That response did not go over well, and J.D. Vance, who had been one of the American officials most directly involved in receiving and acting on those predictions, apparently made his frustration known in terms that were direct and unambiguous. That's the core of the feud as the reporting describes it. Now let's talk about why this matters so much. The US-Israel relationship is one of the most consequential bilateral relationships in the world. It shapes American foreign policy across the entire Middle East. It influences American domestic politics in ways that affect elections and legislation, and the careers of politicians at every level. And it has been built over decades on a foundation of trust. Specifically, the trust that American officials can rely on Israeli intelligence assessments and Israeli military predictions when making decisions that affect American interests and American credibility. When that trust is broken, everything downstream from it becomes unstable. The policy decisions that were made based on those predictions, the public statements that American officials made based on Israeli assurances, the diplomatic positions that were taken with American allies in the region, all of it was built on a foundation that the reporting suggests was less solid than it appeared. And J.D. Vance, according to the new reporting, is angry about it. That anger is significant for several reasons. First, Vance is not someone who has been historically skeptical of Israel or of American support for Israeli security. His political background does not include the kind of progressive foreign policy critique that has sometimes put Democrats at odds with Netanyahu's government. This isn't ideological disagreement dressed up as a policy dispute. This is a specific concrete grievance about specific concrete failures. That makes it harder to dismiss, and harder for the Netanyahu government to manage with the usual tools it uses to navigate American criticism. Second, Vance's position as vice president means this isn't just one politician's frustration. It represents a shift in the posture of the American executive branch toward the Netanyahu government. When the vice president is angry, that anger has institutional weight. It shapes how meetings are conducted, how intelligence is shared, how American support is calibrated in real time. And right now, the reporting suggests that anger is affecting the relationship in ways that are visible to people on both sides. Third, the timing of this reporting, coming as the Iran crisis is escalating, is particularly significant. Because one of the key questions in any potential conflict with Iran is the reliability of the intelligence being provided to American decision-makers. If there are already serious doubts about the accuracy of predictions made by one of America's closest regional partners, that doubt doesn't stay contained to the Gaza situation. It spreads. It creates a more skeptical posture toward all intelligence assessments coming from the region. And a more skeptical posture toward intelligence assessments is exactly the kind of thing that changes military and diplomatic calculations at the highest levels. Now let's turn to the press censorship story, because it's just as alarming, and it's directly connected. American journalists have been reporting from conflict zones for as long as American journalism has existed. It's one of the most fundamental elements of the free press tradition. The public's right to know what is happening in places where American money, American weapons, and American diplomatic support are being used. What is now being reported is that Israel is actively censoring American press coverage, blocking access, preventing journalists from reaching certain areas, in some cases, directly interfering with the ability of American reporters to do their jobs. That's not a minor diplomatic complaint, that's a direct challenge to one of the foundational principles of the American press tradition. And it puts the American government in an extraordinarily uncomfortable position. Because the United States has built much of its foreign policy identity around the defense of press freedom globally, it criticizes authoritarian governments that restrict journalists. It conditions certain kinds of support on commitments to transparency and accountability. And now, it is watching one of its closest allies actively censor the American press. The response from Washington has been by most accounts insufficient to match the seriousness of what's happening. Why? Because the relationship with Israel is so complex, so politically sensitive, and so deeply embedded in American domestic politics, that any strong response creates complications that administration officials are reluctant to accept. But the reporting that connects the press censorship to the Vance-Netanyahu feud suggests something important. The censorship isn't separate from the failed predictions dispute. It's part of the same dynamic. If American journalists had full access, they would be reporting on the gap between what was predicted and what actually happened. They would be providing the public with the kind of detailed, on-the-ground reporting that makes it impossible for either government to maintain a narrative that doesn't match reality. Limiting that access limits that reporting. And limiting that reporting makes it easier to manage the narrative around the failed predictions. That connection, if accurate, makes the press censorship story significantly more serious than it would be on its own. It's not just about press freedom in the abstract. It's about the active management of information in a way that prevents accountability for specific failures that have had specific consequences for American policy. Let's talk about what this means for J.D. Vance personally, because his position in this story is genuinely complex. On one hand, the reporting suggests he is one of the American officials most directly frustrated by the Netanyahu government's handling of this situation. That frustration, if it's genuine, puts him in the uncomfortable position of being angry at an ally that his own political base strongly supports. The Republican base, and particularly the evangelical Christian community that has been a significant part of Vance's political coalition, has historically been among the strongest supporters of Israel and of close American-Israeli relations. Public criticism of Netanyahu, or even visible frustration with his government, carries political risks in that community that Vance is acutely aware of. Which means he is navigating a situation where his private frustration and his public positioning need to be managed very carefully. Too much public distance from Netanyahu, and he risks alienating part of his base. Too much public deference to Netanyahu, and he's seen as putting a foreign government's interests ahead of American accountability. That's a narrow path. And the reporting that's now surfacing makes it narrower by putting the private frustration into the public record. On the other hand, there's a version of this story that actually strengthens Vance's position, with a different part of his coalition. The America First tradition that Vance has drawn from is not uniformly pro-intervention in the Middle East. There is a significant strand of that tradition that has always been skeptical of American entanglement in regional conflicts, regardless of which ally is involved. For those voters, an American vice president who pushes back on a foreign prime minister for providing inaccurate assessments that shaped American policy is not a liability. It's an asset. It's someone who is putting American interests first. Even in a relationship where that's politically complicated, the press censorship dimension of this story adds another layer. The idea of a foreign government actively blocking American journalists is something that both progressive and conservative media figures have reasons to be outraged by. And an American vice president who is seen as taking that seriously, as pushing back on it, as insisting that American journalists have the access they need to do their jobs, is playing on terrain that is broadly favorable. That's the political landscape Vance is navigating right now. Complex, full of contradictions, with risks on multiple sides, but also with opportunities that didn't exist before this reporting surfaced. The broader question that all of this raises is one about the future of the US-Israel relationship itself. That relationship has weathered significant strains before. Different American administrations have had very different approaches to Israeli policy. Some have been more confrontational, some more deferential, and the relationship has survived all of them. But the specific combination of circumstances right now, the failed predictions dispute, The press censorship, the Iran crisis escalation, the Vance-Netanyahu friction, creates a pressure that is qualitatively different from previous strains, because it's happening at a moment when American foreign policy in the Middle East is already under significant scrutiny, when the $200 billion Iran war budget is on the table, when Pakistan is trying to mediate a crisis that could draw in multiple regional actors, when the domestic political pressures on every decision are more intense than they've been in years. In that context, a visible rift between the vice president and one of America's closest allies is not an isolated diplomatic problem. It's a signal about the coherence and the reliability of American foreign policy at one of the most consequential moments in recent history. And those signals matter. To allies, to adversaries, to the markets that watch geopolitical stability. As a proxy for economic certainty, the reporting that just surfaced has opened a window into a relationship that both governments would have preferred to keep private, and what it reveals is more complicated, more fraught, and more significant than the official version of events has suggested. J.D. Vance is frustrated with Netanyahu, Israel is censoring American journalists, and the connection between those two facts is becoming impossible to ignore. This story is not finished, and the next chapter will tell us a great deal about whether American foreign policy in this region has the coherence and the honesty to address what it has uncovered, or whether the pressure to maintain the official narrative will be too strong to resist. Either way, the truth is closer to the surface than it has been in a very long time, and that alone changes everything. But let's not lose sight of the people most directly affected by all of this, because foreign policy discussions at this level have a tendency to float into abstraction, into the language of bilateral relationships and diplomatic frameworks and geopolitical calculations that sound important but feel distant from ordinary life. The reality is more concrete. American journalists who cannot do their jobs cannot inform the American public. And an American public that cannot get accurate information about what is happening in places where its money and its weapons are being used cannot make informed judgments about whether those decisions are correct. That's not an abstract principle. That's the basic mechanism of democratic accountability. When it breaks down, the people who suffer the consequences are not the diplomats or the strategists or the politicians managing the relationship. They're ordinary citizens who are paying for a foreign policy they can't fully see. And the journalists who are being blocked from doing their work are not just professional victims of a diplomatic dispute. They're the people standing between those ordinary citizens and the information they need. That's why the press censorship story, even for people who don't follow foreign policy closely, matters in ways that are direct and personal. And J.D. Vance, whose entire political identity is built around speaking for the people who have been left out of the decisions that affect their lives, is in a position where his response to this censorship will say something very important about whether that identity is real or rhetorical. Does he push back loudly? Does he insist on American press access as a non-negotiable condition of the relationship? Does he treat the censorship of American journalists as the serious violation of fundamental principles that it is? Or does he manage it quietly, absorb it diplomatically, and allow the official narrative to continue unchallenged? Those choices are being watched by journalists, by press freedom advocates, by the American public, and by the foreign governments that are observing how the United States responds when one of its closest allies violates the principles it claims to stand for. The Vance-Netanyahu feud, the failed predictions, the press censorship, the Iran crisis escalating in the background. All of it is connected, all of it is moving at the same time, and all of it will leave a mark on this moment in American history that will still be visible decades from now. Because moments like this, one when alliances are strained and accountability is tested and the gap between official narratives and reality becomes impossible to ignore, are the moments that define what a country actually stands for, not in its speeches, not in its stated values, in its choices. The choices being made right now, by J.D. Vance and by everyone else with a role in this story, will be the answer to that question. And the answer is still being written, right now, in real time, with consequences that will last far longer than any of the people writing it.